You're too broken to fix, Thea, Ian said, throwing his wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Emily knows how to be a real wife. 6 months later, Emily called me sobbing. Please take him back, she begged. I can't survive what he's doing to me. But what I told her next changed everything.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The morning light streaming through our kitchen window cast shadows across the marble countertops that Ian had insisted we install. Everything in our house had been his choice, from the cold gray color scheme to the uncomfortable modern furniture that looked impressive but felt like sitting on concrete. I stood there in my pajamas, watching my husband of 4 years methodically pack his belongings into expensive leather suitcases, each movement precise and calculated. The movers will come for the rest tomorrow, he said without looking at me, his voice carrying that clinical tone he'd perfected over the past year. I've already spoken with Curtis at the law firm. He'll be handling the divorce paperwork. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the June warmth. The kitchen felt enormous around me, this space where I'd spent countless hours trying to perfect meals he'd inevitably find fault with. Too salty, too bland, not sophisticated enough for his colleagues. Emily would have seasoned it perfectly, he'd say. Emily understood the difference between rustic and refined. Emily. The name had become a constant presence in our home long before Ian ever physically left. Emily, from his marketing firm, with her perfect posture and her master's degree in business strategy. Emily, who never got migraines. Emily, who didn't need anxiety medication. Emily, who could attend company functions without worrying about having a panic attack in the bathroom. I tried to help you, Ian continued, folding his shirts with the same mechanical precision he applied to everything in his life. God knows I tried. The therapy, the medications, all those doctor appointments I had to rearrange my schedule for. But you're not getting better, Thea. If anything, you're getting worse. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was getting worse, but not because of some mysterious deterioration. I was getting worse because living with Ian had become like drowning in slow motion, each day taking me deeper underwater while he stood on the shore, complaining about how poorly I was swimming. My reflection in the kitchen's stainless steel refrigerator showed a woman I barely recognized anymore. Thin shoulders that used to carry confidence now hunched forward defensively. Eyes that had once sparkled with curiosity now held the wary look of someone who'd learned that expressing joy only invited criticism. Hair that I'd stopped styling the way I preferred because Ian said it looked too casual for a woman in her 30s. When had I become this person? When had I started apologizing for existing? The house is paid off, Ian said, zipping his suitcase with finality. I'm leaving it to you in the divorce. Consider it severance pay for 4 years of trying to fix something that can't be fixed. His words hit like physical blows, but I'd grown accustomed to the impact. 4 years of being told I was too sensitive, too anxious, too broken to be the wife he deserved. 4 years of watching him compare me to other women who seemed to navigate life with an ease that felt impossible to me. I thought about the woman I'd been when we met. Thea Morrison, freelance graphic designer who'd built a client base through her creativity and persistence, who'd traveled solo through Europe, who'd once spent 3 weeks in a cabin in Montana with nothing but books and art supplies, who'd laughed so hard at terrible movies that she'd nearly fallen off couches. That woman felt like a character from someone else's story now. I know you think this is cruel, Ian said, finally turning to face me. His expression held no malice, which somehow made it worse. Malice would have implied passion, emotion, some investment in my pain. Instead, he looked at me with the detached concern of a veterinarian discussing a sick animal that couldn't be saved. But staying married to you would be cruel to both of us. You need someone who can handle your issues, and I need a partner, not a patient. The kitchen felt silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of our neighbor Matt mowing his lawn. Normal Saturday morning sounds in a neighborhood where normal people were living normal lives, unaware that mine was dissolving in real time. Emily. I wanted to ask when exactly Emily had entered our marriage, when the late nights at the office had turned into something else, when their professional relationship had become intimate enough for her to have opinions about our private struggles. But I already knew the answer. Emily had been there for months, maybe longer, watching from the sidelines while Ian systematically dismantled my sense of self-worth. The cruelest part wasn't that he was leaving. The cruelest part was how reasonable he made it sound, how he'd positioned himself as the long-suffering husband who'd tried everything, and me as the damaged wife who simply couldn't be fixed. In his version of our story, he was the hero, and I was the tragic character who couldn't rise to meet the demands of real life. "I'll be staying at Emily's apartment until we find something more permanent," he said, lifting his suitcase off the counter. The wedding ring still lay there between us, a small circle of gold that had once represented promises we'd both believed in. "Curtis will contact you about the paperwork. Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be." He moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth, Thea, I do hope you get better. Maybe being on your own will force you to deal with your problems instead of expecting someone else to accommodate them." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone in the kitchen that had never felt like mine anyway. The silence stretched around me like a physical presence, broken only by the sound of his car starting in the driveway, then pulling away. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wedding ring on the counter. 4 years reduced to a piece of jewelry abandoned on granite. 4 years of trying to become the woman he wanted, of swallowing my own needs and preferences, of apologizing for taking up space in my own life. But as I stood there in that perfect, cold kitchen, something unexpected happened. Instead of the crushing despair I'd been bracing for, I felt something else entirely. Relief, like I'd been holding my breath for years and could finally exhale. The woman in the refrigerator's reflection still looked broken, but for the first time in months, she also looked like she might be capable of healing. The real story I was about to discover was just beginning. The bathroom mirror in our master suite told a story I wasn't ready to read. Under the harsh vanity lighting that Ian had chosen because it was more flattering for photographs, I could see every line of exhaustion etched into my face, every hollow curve where confidence used to live. My hands shook as I gripped the marble countertop, the same expensive stone that ran throughout our house like a cold, unforgiving spine. Everything in this bathroom screamed luxury: the rainfall shower, the soaking tub that cost more than most people's cars, the heated floors that Ian insisted we needed for resale value. But luxury, I was learning, meant nothing when you felt like a stranger in your own reflection. When had my shoulders started curving inward like this? When had I begun taking up so little space that I practically disappeared against the white tiles? The woman staring back at me wore a face I remembered from somewhere else, someone else's life, someone who used to wake up excited about the day ahead instead of bracing for the next criticism. I thought about Thea Morrison at 28, the woman who'd met Ian at a gallery opening in downtown Portland. She'd been wearing a vintage dress she'd found at a thrift store and altered herself, her dark hair wild from the October rain, paint still under her fingernails from a client project she'd finished that afternoon. She'd been laughing with Leah, her best friend since college, about some ridiculous installation piece when a man in an expensive suit had approached their group. "Excuse me," he'd said, focusing entirely on me while ignoring the 3 other people in our circle. "I couldn't help but notice your dress. It's very unique." That should have been my first warning. The way he said unique like it was both a compliment and a gentle correction. But I'd been charmed by his attention, by the way he seemed so put together, so adult compared to the artists and freelancers I usually dated. I'd modified it myself, I told him, smoothing the fabric self-consciously. Took it from a 60s shift dress to something more modern. "You're very talented," he'd said, though something in his tone suggested he found the concept of altering thrift store clothing amusing rather than impressive. "I'm Ian. I work in corporate marketing." Corporate marketing. Even then, those words should have told me everything I needed to know about how our worlds would collide.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He lived in a universe of focus groups and brand consistency, where everything had to be measured, tested, and optimized for maximum impact. I lived in a world where inspiration struck at 2 in the morning and beauty could be found in the most unexpected places. But I'd been 28 and tired of dating men who were still figuring themselves out. Ian had a plan, a career trajectory, a 5-year vision board. He seemed like the kind of man who could teach me how to be an adult, how to build something stable and lasting. The mirror showed me what that lesson had cost. My phone buzzed on the bathroom counter, startling me from my reflection. A text from Leah. "Coffee tomorrow? Haven't seen you in forever." Forever? Had it really been that long? I tried to remember the last time I'd seen Leah, my former partner in adventure, the woman who'd once convinced me to drive to the coast at midnight just to watch the sunrise over the ocean. The math was depressing. 6 months? 8? Somewhere in the fog of trying to become Ian's ideal wife, I'd lost track of the people who'd known me before I needed fixing. I started to type back, then stopped. What would I say? That I'd been too busy becoming someone else to maintain the friendships that had once anchored me? That Ian thought Leah was a bad influence because she encouraged my chaotic tendencies? Instead, I set the phone aside and turned back to the mirror. The woman in the reflection had once driven across country alone, camping in national parks and sketching landscapes until her hands cramped. She'd pitched design concepts to Fortune 500 companies via video calls from coffee shops, wearing thrift store blazers over vintage band t-shirts. She'd hosted dinner parties where guests sat on mismatched furniture and ADOS plates she'd collected from estate sales, everyone laughing too loud and staying too late. That woman had been messy, unpredictable, passionate about things that didn't always make practical sense. She'd been too much in some ways and not enough in others, but she'd been authentically, unapologetically herself. When had I started seeing those qualities as flaws instead of features? I remembered the first time Ian had suggested I tone it down for one of his work events. Just a gentle recommendation that I wear something more classic instead of the vintage emerald dress I'd planned. Nothing wrong with my choice, he'd assured me, but his colleagues were pretty conservative and he wanted to make sure I felt comfortable. I'd changed clothes that night, choosing a black sheath dress that could have belonged to anyone. I'd felt invisible at the party, but Ian had been proud of how well I'd fit in. The validation felt good in the moment, like I'd passed some important test. But now, staring at my reflection 4 years later, I could see the pattern clearly. Each small accommodation, each tiny adjustment to better suit his world had been another layer of myself I'd shed. Like a snake that molts so many times it forgets what it originally looked like underneath. The house around me felt enormous and empty, all sharp corners and hard surfaces that echoed instead of absorbed. I'd wanted to add plants, soft throws, artwork from local artists I admired. Ian had vetoed each suggestion gently but firmly. Plants were high maintenance, soft textures collect dust. Local art was too personal for a space where we entertain clients. Slowly, I'd stopped making suggestions. I'd learned to see our home through his eyes. Impressive, professional, optimized for making the right impression rather than for actually living. But living, I was beginning to understand, had been the point all along. I touched the mirror gently, my fingertips meeting my reflections. Somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the careful emptiness, I could still see traces of the woman I used to be. She was buried deep, almost invisible, but she was still there, still waiting. The question was whether it was too late to dig her out. Outside, I could hear Matt next door starting up his leaf blower, the sound cutting through the morning quiet. Normal people doing normal things, maintaining the lives they'd built for themselves instead of lives they'd been talked into accepting. For the first time in years, normal sounded like something worth fighting for. The gallery opening where I'd met Ian had been Leah's idea.
"You need to get out more," she'd said, dragging me away from my computer where I'd been hunched over a logo design for a local bakery. All work and no play makes Thea a dull designer.
I'd protested, of course. I had deadlines, clients to impress, bills to pay. Freelance graphic design meant feast or famine, and I was in the middle of a feast period that I couldn't afford to waste. But Leah had that particular brand of stubborn persistence that had gotten us both into trouble since our freshman year at Portland State. It's not just any opening, she'd insisted, waving the invitation she'd somehow acquired. This is Connor Blake's debut solo show. You know, the sculptor who did that incredible installation at Pioneer Square last year. And there'll be wine, good wine, not the box stuff you've been surviving on. Connor Blake. I remembered his work. Massive metal sculptures that seemed to defy gravity, pieces that made you stop walking and just stare. The kind of art that reminded you why humans created things beyond mere necessity. Fine, I'd said, closing my laptop with theatrical reluctance. But I'm wearing whatever I want. Would I expect anything less? Leah had grinned, knowing she'd won. The dress I'd chosen that night was one of my favorites, a 1960s shift I'd found at an estate sale in southeast Portland, originally a plain navy blue that I'd hand-dyed in graduated shades of teal and emerald. I'd taken it in at the waist and added subtle beading along the neckline, transforming something simple into something that felt uniquely mine. "You look like a mermaid who learned to walk on land," Leah had said when she picked me up, and I'd taken it as the compliment it was meant to be. The gallery had been packed with Portland's art crowd, a mix of serious collectors, young artists trying to network, and curious locals drawn in by the free wine and the promise of seeing something beautiful. Connor's sculptures dominated the space, their twisted metal forms catching the track lighting in ways that made them seem alive. I'd been standing in front of a particularly stunning piece, something that looked like frozen lightning rendered in steel, when Leah had nudged me. "Don't look now, but that guy in the expensive suit has been staring at you for the last 5 minutes." Of course, I'd looked immediately. Across the room, near a smaller sculpture that resembled a metallic tree, stood a man who seemed to belong in a different venue entirely. While everyone else was dressed in the eclectic mix of vintage, artistic, and deliberately casual that defined Portland's art scene, he wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture spoke of confidence, and when our eyes met, he'd smiled with the kind of practiced charm that suggested he was used to getting whatever he wanted. "He's handsome," admitted Tiffany, Leah's roommate who'd joined our little group, in a very, "I drive a luxury sedan and have a retirement plan" kind of way. "Exactly what Thea needs," Leah had laughed, "someone to teach her about things like health insurance and matching dinnerware." They'd been joking, but something in the observation had struck a chord. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck for so long that the idea of stability, of someone who had their life figured out, held an undeniable appeal. I was tired of checking my bank account before buying groceries, tired of wondering if my aging Honda would start on cold mornings, tired of explaining to my parents why I didn't have a real job yet. When Ian had approached our group, introducing himself with that confident handshake and direct eye contact, he'd seemed like he could solve problems I didn't even know I had. "I couldn't help but notice your dress," he'd said, and the way he said it made it sound like a compliment, even though I caught the slight hesitation before unique. We'd talked for over an hour that night. He'd been genuinely interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about the design process, the challenges of building a freelance business. He'd listened intently when I'd explained how I'd modified the dress, though I'd noticed him glancing occasionally at other women in more conventional cocktail attire. "You have real talent," he'd said as the evening wound down. "But talent isn't always enough in business. You need strategy, positioning, a professional image that makes clients take you seriously." At the time, I'd heard concern and genuine interest in helping me succeed. Looking back now, I could hear the first subtle suggestion that I wasn't quite right as I was. He'd asked for my number as people began filtering out of the gallery, and I'd given it to him, flattered by the attention of someone who seemed so put together, so adult. "I'd love to take you to dinner somewhere nice," he'd said. "I know a place downtown that I think you'd really enjoy." Somewhere nice. Even then, the implication was clear. Not the quirky neighborhood spots where I usually ate, not the food trucks or dive bars that Leah and I frequented. Somewhere that met his standards of appropriate.
But I'd been charmed. After years of dating artists and musicians who split appetizers because money was tight, the promise of somewhere nice had felt like being invited into a world I'd only observed from the outside. Our first date had been at Le Bernardin, an upscale French restaurant where the servers wore bow ties and knew the wine list by heart. Ian had ordered for both of us after asking what I preferred, and then gently suggesting that I might enjoy something else more. "Trust me," he'd said with that confident smile. "I've eaten here before. You'll love the salmon." I'd wanted the duck, but I'd gone along with his suggestion. The salmon had been excellent, perfectly prepared, and Ian had been pleased that I'd enjoyed his choice. I'd felt sophisticated, adult, like I was finally playing in the major leagues instead of the scrappy minor league world of freelance design. It wasn't until much later that I'd realized I'd never actually gotten to order what I wanted that night. Or most nights after that. The pattern had been subtle at first, gentle suggestions about restaurants, about clothes that might be more flattering, about the kind of clients I should pursue to build a more stable business. Each recommendation came wrapped in genuine care, in his desire to help me reach my potential. "You're so talented, Thea," he'd say. "I just want to help you present yourself in a way that matches that talent." And I'd wanted to match his world, wanted to be worthy of the life he seemed to offer. He had a corner office with a view of the river, a condo in the Pearl District, a social circle that included doctors and lawyers, and people who took skiing trips to Aspen. He represented security, success, the kind of future that felt responsible and grown up. So when he'd suggested I might want to elevate my brand, I'd listened. When he'd offered to help me network with more serious clients, I'd been grateful. When he'd proposed after 18 months of dating, I'd said yes without hesitation, believing I was saying yes to becoming the best version of myself. I just hadn't realized that the best version of myself, in Ian's mind, meant becoming someone else entirely. Sitting in our cold, perfect house 4 years later, I wondered what would have happened if I'd ordered the duck that first night. If I'd trusted my own preferences instead of his expertise. If I'd recognized that someone who truly cared about me would want to know what I wanted, not convince me to want something else. But it was too late for what ifs now. Ian was gone, probably unpacking his expensive suitcases in Emily's apartment, telling her how relieved he was to finally be free from the burden of trying to fix someone who couldn't be fixed. The question now was whether I could remember how to fix myself. The first major boundary crossing happened 3 months into our relationship, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. Ian had invited me to his company's annual holiday party, a formal affair at the downtown Hilton that his marketing firm threw every December to impress their biggest clients. "I'm so excited for everyone to meet you," he'd said, though his tone carried a nervous edge I'd never heard before. "Just maybe we could go shopping together. I want to make sure you have something that photographs well." Photographs well. The phrase should have set off alarm bells, but I'd been flattered that he cared enough about my impression on his colleagues to want to help. I'd assumed he meant we'd find something elegant together, something that would make me feel confident and beautiful. Instead, he'd steered me toward a boutique in the Pearl District, where everything was black, gray, or beige, and nothing had personality. "This would be perfect," he'd said, holding up a simple black sheath dress that looked like it belonged in a corporate catalog. "Classic, sophisticated. It won't compete with your natural beauty." I'd been standing in front of a mirror holding a deep burgundy dress, with subtle embroidered details that made me feel like myself, only elevated. "What about this one? The color is gorgeous, and the embroidery, it's a bit much, don't you think?" Ian had interrupted gently. "Remember, this isn't an art gallery opening. These are business people. You want to blend in, not stand out for the wrong reasons." The wrong reasons. I'd stared at my reflection in the burgundy dress, trying to see what he saw. The embroidery suddenly looked gaudy instead of elegant. The color seemed too bold, too attention-seeking. Through his eyes, I looked like someone trying too hard instead of someone who belonged. I'd bought the black dress. At the party, I'd felt invisible among the other wives and girlfriends, most of whom wore similar conservative cocktail attire. But Ian had been proud, introducing me to his boss with obvious satisfaction. "This is my girlfriend, Thea," he'd said to a silver-haired man named Curtis, who'd barely looked at me before launching into a discussion about quarterly projections. "She's a graphic designer." "Oh, how nice," Curtis had replied dismissively. "Like freelance computer stuff?" "She's very talented," Ian had added quickly, and I'd caught the slight emphasis on very, as if he needed to convince his boss that my work had value. "She's been thinking about transitioning to more corporate clients, haven't you, honey?" I hadn't been thinking about that at all. I loved working with local businesses, small nonprofits, artists who needed visual identities that reflected their unique missions. But surrounded by people in expensive suits discussing profit margins and market penetration, my work suddenly felt small and amateurish. "That's smart," Curtis had nodded approvingly. "Corporate design is where the real money is, much more stable than all that artsy stuff." All that artsy stuff. My portfolio, my passion, my carefully cultivated relationships with clients who trusted me to capture their vision, dismissed in 4 words. Ian had squeezed my hand, and I'd smiled and agreed that stability was important, that maybe it was time to think bigger, more professionally. That night marked the beginning of what I now recognized as a systematic campaign to reshape not just how I presented myself, but who I fundamentally was. The suggestions came gradually, always framed as helpful guidance from someone who wanted the best for me. Maybe I should consider raising my rates and targeting larger companies. Maybe I should update my portfolio website to look more corporate-friendly. Maybe I should think about getting some professional headshots instead of using the casual photos Lee had taken of me in Powell's bookstore. "You have so much potential," Ian would say, reviewing my work with the clinical eye of someone conducting a performance evaluation. "But potential means nothing if you don't package it correctly. Look at this logo you did for that coffee shop. It's creative, but would a Fortune 500 company take you seriously based on work like this?" I'd started second-guessing every design choice, every client I accepted, every aspect of my professional identity. The vintage dress boutique that had commissioned a playful hand-lettered logo suddenly seemed frivolous. The community theater that needed posters for their Shakespeare festival felt unprofessional. Even the animal rescue organization that I'd worked with pro bono, surely that made me look like someone who didn't value her own work appropriately. Within 6 months, I'd redesigned my entire portfolio to emphasize corporate projects, even the small ones. I'd changed my website from warm personal copy that reflected my voice to professional, formal language that could have been written by anyone. I'd started declining projects that excited me in favor of ones that looked impressive on paper. The transformation of my social life had been even more insidious. Ian never forbade me from seeing Leah or my other friends from the art community. Instead, he'd create subtle scheduling conflicts. "Oh, tonight's the night you were going to meet Leah for drinks," he'd say with apologetic concern. I forgot I'd already made reservations at Kennard. "I can cancel, but they have a 3-week waiting list." Or he'd invite me to events with his colleagues that happened to conflict with gallery openings or dinner parties with my friends. When I'd suggest bringing Leah or Tiffany along to his work functions, he'd explain gently that they might not be comfortable in such a formal setting. "You know how Leah gets around people she considers pretentious," he'd say. "I just don't want her to feel out of place. Or worse, say something that embarrasses you." Gradually, I'd stopped making plans with my old friends, not because Ian had asked me to, but because it became easier to avoid the constant negotiations, the subtle implications that my social circle reflected poorly on my judgment. My apartment had been next. 6 months into our relationship, Ian had started spending most nights at my place in southeast Portland, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls, vintage furniture I'd collected over years of estate sale hunting, and artwork from local artists covering every available surface. "This place has so much character," he'd said the first time he'd seen it, though the way he'd said character suggested it wasn't entirely a compliment. "Very eclectic." Over the following months, he'd begun suggesting small improvements. The vintage armchair that had been my grandmother's was probably uncomfortable for guests. The collection of art books stacked on every surface looked cluttered. The The mismatched dishes I'd loved for their unique patterns were hard to photograph. Well, for the dinner party Instagram posts, he'd started encouraging me to make.
I'm not saying change everything, he'd assured me when I'd hesitated about replacing my grandmother's chair, but you're evolving, Thea. Your space should evolve with you. One by one, my treasured possessions had been relocated to storage or donated to Goodwill. In their place came furniture from West Elm, neutral-colored rugs, minimalist artwork that looked like it belonged in a hotel lobby. My apartment had become more sophisticated, more adult, more suitable for the kind of entertaining that impressed his colleagues. It had also become a place where I felt like a guest instead of a resident. The most devastating change had been the slowest, the erosion of my voice in our relationship. Ian had a gift for making his preferences sound like logical conclusions that any reasonable person would reach. I was thinking we should try that new sushi place on 23rd, I'd suggest. Sushi's pretty heavy for a Wednesday night, don't you think? What about that salad place Curtis recommended? It's supposed to have amazing quinoa bowls. I'd never expressed any interest in quinoa bowls, but somehow we'd end up there anyway, and Ian would be pleased that I was finally developing more sophisticated tastes. The pattern had extended to everything, from weekend activities to vacation destinations to the way I styled my hair. Each individual instance had seemed reasonable, even caring. Ian wanted me to experience new things, to broaden my horizons, to reach my full potential. It wasn't until years later, sitting alone in our sterile house, that I could see the pattern for what it really was, the systematic dismantling of everything that made me who I was, replaced with a carefully curated version that met his specifications. I thought he was helping me become a better version of myself, but there's a difference between growth and erasure, between support and control. I was finally beginning to understand which one I'd experienced. The memory issues started about 2 years into our marriage, though Ian assured me they'd always been there. "You've always been scattered, Thea," he'd say, with that patient smile when I'd insist I remembered things differently. "It's part of your creative personality, but maybe we should work on improving your focus." I'd been standing in our kitchen, staring at the grocery list I was certain I'd written the night before. Organic blueberries, sourdough bread, the expensive imported cheese Ian preferred. But the handwriting looked different somehow, more careful and controlled than my usual hurried scrawl. "Did you rewrite my grocery list?" I'd asked him that morning, holding up the paper. Ian had looked up from his laptop with genuine confusion. "Why would I rewrite your grocery list? You wrote that yesterday evening while I was on my conference call with the Tokyo office. Don't you remember?" I'd remembered writing a list, but I'd also remembered including items he typically dismissed as unnecessary indulgences. The fancy chocolate I craved during stressful deadlines, the obscure spices I liked experimenting with, the frozen dumplings from the Asian market that reminded me of late nights in college with Leah. "I thought I'd written down some other things," I'd said uncertainly. "Like what?" His tone had been patient, almost clinical, the way you might speak to someone whose memory you couldn't trust. I'd tried to recall the specific items, but suddenly I wasn't sure. Had I wanted those things, or just thought about wanting them? The distinction felt important, but I couldn't grasp why. "Never mind," I'd said finally. "You're probably right." These moments of confusion had multiplied over the months. Conversations I was sure we'd had would be denied. Plans I thought we'd made together would turn out to be things I'd apparently misunderstood. My own preferences and opinions would be gently corrected with reminders of what I'd actually said or wanted in the past. "You told me last week that you wanted to cut back on freelance work," Ian would say, when I'd express frustration about turning down a project I was excited about. "Remember? You said you were tired of the inconsistent income and wanted something more stable." Had I said that? The words sounded like something I might say, but they felt hollow when I tried to connect them to actual feelings I remembered having. "You've never liked spicy food," he'd remind me when I'd reach for hot sauce at restaurants, even though I distinctly remembered loving the fiery curries at our neighborhood Thai place. I'd remember feeling sick after Mexican food, but I couldn't recall whether it had been from spice or from the anxiety that had started accompanying most of our dinner conversations.
The most unsettling incidents involved my work. I'd finish a design project, feel proud of the creative solution I'd developed, only to have Ian review it with concerned disapproval.
"This isn't really your best work, is it?" he'd say, studying my latest logo design for a local bookstore. "It feels rushed, not up to your usual standards." I'd look at the design again, trying to see what he saw. The lettermark had felt playful and inviting when I'd created it, perfectly suited to the cozy neighborhood bookshop it represented. But under Ian's scrutiny, it suddenly looked amateurish, unprofessional. "Maybe you're taking on too many projects," he'd continue. "Quality over quantity, right? That's what separates professional designers from hobbyists." Hobbyists. The word would sting every time, making me question whether I was deluding myself about my own capabilities. "I've been thinking," he'd said one evening about 6 months before he left, "maybe it would help if I started reviewing your work before you send it to clients, just to make sure it meets professional standards. I have experience with brand management. I could help you avoid embarrassing mistakes." Embarrassing mistakes? When had my work become something potentially embarrassing, rather than something I was proud of? I'd agreed to let him review my designs, telling myself it was smart to get a business perspective on my creative work, but his feedback had been consistently negative, always delivered with that same patient concern that made me feel like a child whose finger paintings were being gently criticized by a well-meaning adult. "This color palette is too playful for a law office," he'd say, or "this typeface doesn't convey enough authority," or "the client probably expects something more traditional." Gradually, I'd started second-guessing every creative decision before I made it. What would Ian think? Would this meet his standards of professionalism? Was I being too artistic again, forgetting that design was supposed to serve business objectives rather than express personality? My portfolio had become increasingly conservative, filled with safe choices that looked like everything else in the corporate design world. The spark that had once made my work distinctive, the willingness to take creative risks, to inject personality and warmth into visual identities, had been systematically edited out. But the most damaging gaslighting had involved my emotional responses to his behavior. When I'd try to address something that hurt or confused me, Ian would listen with that practiced patience before gently correcting my interpretation of events. "I think you might be overreacting," he'd say when I'd expressed frustration about feeling shut out of decisions about our social calendar. "I'm just trying to be efficient. You've said before that you don't enjoy making small talk with my colleagues anyway." Had I said that? I definitely felt uncomfortable at his work events, but I'd assumed that was because I was being actively excluded from conversations, not because I inherently disliked the people involved. "You're being very sensitive today," he'd observe when I'd get upset about his criticism of my work. "Are you getting enough sleep? Maybe you should talk to your doctor about adjusting your anxiety medication." My sensitivity, my sleep patterns, my medication, everything became a potential explanation for why I was reacting unreasonably to his perfectly reasonable behavior. The most insidious part was how he'd frame his constant corrections as concern for my well-being. "I'm worried about you," he'd say when I'd expressed any dissatisfaction with our relationship or my increasingly constrained life. "You seem stressed lately. Maybe you're taking on too much." Too much. As if my desire for creative fulfillment, meaningful friendships, or a voice in my own life constituted an unreasonable burden I was placing on myself. "I just want you to be happy," he'd continue, and the sincerity in his voice would make me question whether my unhappiness was a personal failing rather than a reasonable response to feeling erased. By the time he left, I'd been so thoroughly convinced of my own unreliability, my scattered memory, my oversensitivity, my unprofessional standards, my tendency to overreact, that his departure felt less like abandonment and more like the inevitable consequence of my own inadequacies. "I tried to help you," he'd said that last morning, and I'd believed him. Even as I watched him pack his expensive luggage, even as he delivered his final assessment of my fundamental brokenness, part of me had accepted that this was simply the natural outcome of being the kind of person who couldn't be fixed.
It wasn't until I was alone in our silent house, surrounded by the carefully curated life he'd constructed for us, that I began to wonder if my memory of who I used to be might be more reliable than his version of who I'd always been.
The woman who'd driven across the country alone, who'd built a successful freelance business from nothing, who'd once been confident enough to alter thrift store dresses and wear them to art galleries, had she really been as scattered and unprofessional as Ian had convinced me? Or had she been someone worth knowing, someone worth defending, someone who'd been systematically convinced to doubt her own reality until she disappeared altogether? Standing in that cold, perfect kitchen, I was finally ready to find out. Emily had entered our marriage long before she'd entered Ian's bed. She'd been a ghost presence in our conversations for over a year, the invisible standard against which I was constantly measured and found wanting. Emily finished the Morrison account presentation today, Ian would mention casually over dinner, as if sharing office gossip rather than delivering a subtle indictment of my own productivity. 3 weeks ahead of schedule. She has this incredible ability to anticipate client needs before they even articulate them. I'd nod and make appropriate interested sounds while internally cataloging my own recent failures to anticipate anything correctly. The logo design I'd had to revise 4 times before the client was satisfied, the branding project where I'd completely misunderstood the target demographic, the website mock-up that Ian had diplomatically suggested might be a bit too creative for the conservative law firm I was pitching. Emily, apparently, never had to revise anything. Emily understood instinctively what clients wanted. Emily possessed some mystical combination of creativity and business acumen that allowed her to navigate professional challenges with effortless grace. She's presenting to the Yamamoto Group next week, Ian would continue, cutting his grass-fed steak with surgical precision. Solo presentation. Curtis specifically requested her after seeing her work on the Peterson campaign. The Yamamoto Group, a multinational corporation whose advertising budget probably exceeded my entire annual income. The kind of client I'd never even dream of approaching, let alone impressing enough to warrant a solo presentation request. That's wonderful for her, I'd manage, trying to sound genuinely pleased rather than devastated by the comparison. She started exactly where you are now, Ian would add, as if offering encouragement rather than highlighting my stagnation. Freelance work, small local clients. But she had the vision to see where the real opportunities were. Sometimes I think if you could just develop that kind of strategic thinking. He'd trail off, letting the implication hang in the air. If I could just develop Emily's strategic thinking, her client intuition, her professional instincts, then maybe I could achieve something worthwhile too. Maybe I could become someone worth being proud of. The comparisons weren't limited to professional accomplishments. Emily, it seemed, excelled at every aspect of being a successful adult woman. Emily brought the most amazing appetizers to the office potluck, these little salmon tartare things with homemade crackers. She made the crackers herself, can you believe that? From scratch. I'd look down at the store-bought hummus I'd planned to contribute to his company's next social event and feel a familiar wave of inadequacy. When had I stopped making things from scratch? When had convenience become more important than the kind of thoughtful effort that apparently came naturally to Emily? She's training for a marathon, would come another casual observation. Up at 5 every morning for her long runs. She says it helps her think through creative challenges. I'd been struggling to maintain my twice-weekly yoga classes, often skipping them when work deadlines loomed or when the anxiety about my declining client base made it impossible to focus on anything as frivolous as physical wellness. Emily, meanwhile, was apparently channeling her pre-dawn athletic dedication into professional breakthrough insights. Emily speaks 3 languages, Ian mentioned one evening while we were watching a foreign film with subtitles: French, Spanish, and Japanese. She says it helps her understand cultural nuances in global marketing campaigns. I'd studied French in college, had even been reasonably conversational during my semester abroad in Lyon, but that felt like a lifetime ago, and my language skills had atrophied from disuse until I could barely order coffee in French, let alone discuss cultural nuances.
Emily's trilingual fluency made my rusty college French seem like a pathetic affectation.
The most painful comparisons involved the kind of social confidence that I'd once possessed but had somehow lost along the way. Emily tells the funniest stories at client dinners. Ian would share with obvious admiration. She has this way of making everyone feel included, even when she's talking about complex strategic concepts. People just gravitate toward her. I remembered being that person once. The woman who could hold court at dinner parties, who could make strangers laugh, who could navigate social situations with ease and genuine enjoyment. But somewhere in the process of trying to become worthy of Ian's world, I'd lost that natural confidence. Now I felt self-conscious in social situations, second-guessing every comment, worried about saying something that would embarrass him or reveal my inadequacies to his colleagues. She wore this incredible dress to the awards ceremony. He'd mention after company events I hadn't been invited to attend. Deep blue, very elegant. She has such sophisticated taste, never tries too hard, you know. I'd think about my own closet, full of clothes that Ian had helped me select for their appropriateness rather than because I loved them. When had I stopped trusting my own sense of style? When had my preferences become something to be corrected rather than celebrated? The cruelest comparisons were the ones that highlighted what I'd apparently lost rather than what Emily had gained. Emily has such a positive attitude. Ian would observe when I'd express frustration about a difficult client or a project that wasn't going well. She says challenges are just opportunities to prove your capabilities. She never lets setbacks get her down. Never lets setbacks get her down. The implication was clear. I was someone who let setbacks affect me too much, who lacked the emotional resilience to handle professional disappointments with Emily's apparent grace. She's so low maintenance, he'd add when I'd need reassurance about a work decision or emotional support during a particularly stressful period. Never needs anyone to manage her moods or validate her choices. She just figures things out and moves forward. Low maintenance, high emotional intelligence, natural confidence, professional instincts, marathon-level discipline, multilingual sophistication, homemade crackers. Emily had become less a real person than a collection of qualities I lacked, achievements I hadn't reached, capabilities I didn't possess. She was everything I wasn't, and Ian's casual observations about her perfection served as a constant reminder of my own deficiencies. The most insidious part was how he'd frame these comparisons as motivation rather than criticism. I'm not saying you should be exactly like Emily, he'd clarify when I'd point out how dispiriting these constant comparisons felt. I'm just showing you what's possible. You have just as much potential. You just need to apply yourself differently. Apply myself differently. As if my struggles were simply a matter of insufficient effort rather than the natural result of having my confidence systematically undermined. Emily didn't become successful overnight, he'd continue. She worked for it. She made strategic choices about how to present herself, how to build her skills, how to position herself professionally. There's no reason you couldn't do the same thing. Except that Emily had apparently made these strategic choices while maintaining her essential self, while I felt like I was losing pieces of who I was with every improvement Ian suggested. Emily's success seemed to enhance her natural qualities, while my attempts at professional growth felt like betrayals of everything I'd once valued about my own work and approach to life. By the time Ian left me for Emily, I'd been competing with her ghost for so long that her real presence in his life felt almost anticlimactic. Of course he'd chosen her. She was everything he'd been trying to help me become. Everything I'd failed to achieve despite his patient guidance. She was the woman I might have been if I'd been better, smarter, more disciplined, more naturally gifted. She was the successful version of me, the one who'd made all the right choices while I'd made all the wrong ones. At least, that's what I believed until the day she called me, crying, begging me to take him back. That's when I realized that Emily hadn't been the perfect woman Ian described. She'd been another victim of the same impossible standards, the same systematic erosion of self-worth, the same cruel comparisons that had destroyed my sense of who I was. The only difference was that I'd had 4 years to be broken down slowly. Emily was about to discover what happened when that process was accelerated. The mirror in our ensuite bathroom had become my enemy, not because it was unkind, but because it was brutally honest about what I'd allowed myself to become.
It was 3 weeks before Ian left, and I just returned from what would be my final client meeting as a married woman. The owner of a small nonprofit arts organization had wanted to discuss rebranding their visual identity, exactly the kind of meaningful, creative project I used to love. But I'd spent the entire meeting second-guessing every suggestion I made, hearing Ian's voice in my head cataloging all the ways my ideas fell short of professional standards. "We want something that captures the joy of community art," the director had said, her eyes bright with the kind of passion I remembered feeling about my own work. "Something that makes people feel welcome, like they belong here, regardless of their background or experience level." Joy, welcome, belonging. I'd nodded and taken notes, but the concepts felt foreign, like she was speaking a language I used to be fluent in but had somehow forgotten. "What we don't want," she'd continued, "is something corporate or sterile. We've seen too many nonprofits try to look professional and end up losing their soul in the process." Her words had hit like a physical blow. Losing their soul in the process? Was that what had happened to my work? In trying to meet Ian's standards of professionalism, had I stripped away everything that once made my designs distinctive and meaningful? I'd shown her 3 concept directions, all safe, conservative, utterly forgettable. She'd been polite about them, but I could see the disappointment in her face. These weren't the designs of someone who understood joy or community or belonging. These were the designs of someone who'd forgotten what those things felt like. "Could we maybe explore something a bit more," she'd paused, searching for a diplomatic way to express her dissatisfaction, "playful? Something with more personality?" Personality, the word I'd been trained to avoid, the quality Ian had taught me to see as unprofessional rather than valuable. I'd promised to send revised concepts, knowing, even as I said it, that I no longer had access to the part of myself that could create work with genuine personality. That woman had been systematically edited out of existence. Now I stood in our bathroom staring at my reflection after the most professionally humiliating day of my career. The woman looking back at me was a stranger wearing my face. Her shoulders curved inward with defeat. Her eyes held the flat exhaustion of someone who'd forgotten hope for anything better. Her clothes, a neutral blazer and tailored pants that Ian had deemed appropriate for client meetings, made her look like she was cosplaying as a successful person rather than actually being one. When had I started dressing like someone else's idea of what I should be? When had I stopped trusting my own instincts so completely that I couldn't even design a logo without hearing his voice correcting every creative impulse? I touched the mirror with my fingertips, trying to remember the last time I'd looked at my reflection and felt anything other than disappointment. The last time I'd seen potential instead of problems, creativity instead of inadequacy. My phone buzzed with a text from Ian. "Working late again, don't wait up." Working late? With Emily, probably. Reviewing her brilliant presentations, marveling at her strategic insights, appreciating her low-maintenance attitude and natural confidence. Everything I wasn't and would never be. I sank onto the edge of our marble bathtub, the cold stone making me shiver even through my clothes. This bathroom, like everything else in our house, had been designed to impress rather than comfort. The towels were the perfect shade of gray to complement the tile, the fixtures were all brushed nickel, chosen for their contemporary elegance. Even the soap dispenser had been carefully selected to maintain the aesthetic integrity of the space. But when had I last taken a relaxing bath in this expensive tub? When had this bathroom felt like a sanctuary instead of a showroom? I tried to remember what my old apartment bathroom had looked like. Mismatched vintage tiles and soft blues and greens, a clawfoot tub I'd found at a salvage yard and had refinished myself, plants on every available surface because I loved the way they made the small space alive, candles in mason jars because they were cheaper than real votives but created the same warm ambiance. That bathroom had been tiny, impractical by Ian's standards, but I'd loved spending time there. I took long, hot baths while reading novels that had nothing to do with professional development. I'd experimented with different essential oil combinations until I found scents that made me feel centered and creative. I'd hung artwork from local artists whose work spoke to something in my soul, even if it wouldn't photograph well for Instagram.
When had comfort become less important than appearance? When had I stopped creating spaces that nourished me in favor of spaces that would impress people I didn't particularly like? The woman in the mirror looked like she was drowning in someone else's life. Her apartment had been replaced by a house that felt like a high-end hotel. Her eclectic vintage wardrobe had been replaced by clothes that could belong to anyone. Her meaningful work with small businesses and non-profits had been replaced by desperate attempts to land corporate clients who would validate her professionalism. Her friends had been replaced by Ian's colleagues, people who made small talk about market trends and vacation homes in Bend. Her spontaneous adventures had been replaced by carefully planned social events designed to network and impress. Her creative risks had been replaced by safe choices that generated no strong reactions, positive or negative. Even her own preferences had been replaced. I couldn't remember the last time I'd ordered what I actually wanted at a restaurant, chosen a movie I was excited to see, or expressed an opinion without first calculating how it would reflect on Ian's judgment in choosing me as his partner. The most terrifying realization was that I no longer knew what my authentic preferences even were. It had been so long since I'd been allowed to want things freely that I'd forgotten what genuine desire felt like. Did I actually enjoy the minimalist aesthetic Ian had cultivated for our home, or had I just learned to see my former love of color and texture as childish? Did I really prefer the conservative clothing he'd encouraged me to buy, or had I simply internalized his criticisms of my original style? Who was I underneath all these layers of correction and improvement? The question felt both urgent and impossible to answer. 4 years of systematic modification had left me so disconnected from my authentic self that I wasn't sure she still existed. Maybe Ian was right. Maybe the woman I used to be hadn't been sustainable. Maybe trying to recover her would just lead to more disappointment and professional failure. But sitting in that cold, perfect bathroom, looking at my hollow-eyed reflection, I realized that the alternative was worse than failure. The alternative was spending the rest of my life as a carefully constructed facade of a person, successful by Ian's metrics but empty of everything that had once made me feel alive. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what it had felt like to create something I was genuinely proud of. Not something that met professional standards or impressed potential clients, but something that came from the deepest, most honest part of who I was. The memory came slowly, like something emerging from underwater. A logo I'd designed for a community garden in southeast Portland, 3 years before I met Ian. Simple line drawings of vegetables growing together, roots intertwining underground while their leaves reached toward the sun in different directions. The client had cried when I'd shown her the final design. "It's perfect," she'd said. "It captures exactly what we're trying to create, a space where different people can grow together while staying true to themselves." I'd been so proud of that logo. Not because it would look good in my portfolio, but because it had solved a real problem and expressed something true about the human need for both community and individuality. That designer still existed somewhere inside me. The question was whether she was strong enough to survive what it would take to dig her out. Opening my eyes, I looked at my reflection one more time. The woman in the mirror still looked broken, but for the first time in years, she also looked like she might be ready to fight for something worth saving. 3 weeks later, Ian would pack his suitcases and tell me I was too broken to fix. But sitting in that bathroom, I was beginning to suspect that the real problem wasn't that I couldn't be fixed. The real problem was that I'd never been broken in the first place. The morning Ian delivered his final verdict, I'd been sitting at our kitchen table with my laptop, staring at a blank design document for 3 hours. The non-profit project mocked me from my screen. A logo that needed joy, community, belonging. Concepts I'd once understood intuitively, but now felt as foreign as ancient languages. I'd made coffee twice, forgotten to drink either cup, and reorganized my design files 4 times. Anything to avoid confronting the reality that I could no longer do the work I'd built my life around. The creative well that had once seemed bottomless had been methodically drained until nothing remained but anxious perfectionism and the hollow echo of Ian's voice cataloging my professional inadequacies.
Morning, Ian said, entering the kitchen with his usual precision. Shower completed, hair styled, clothes selected for maximum impact at whatever meetings filled his day. He moved through our home like an actor hitting his marks, every gesture calculated for efficiency. Morning, I replied without looking up from my laptop screen, hoping he wouldn't notice the complete absence of actual work happening. But Ian noticed everything, especially my failures. "How's the nonprofit project coming along?" he asked, pouring himself coffee from the pot I'd made and forgotten. His tone carried that familiar note of patient interest that had once felt supportive, but now sounded like a performance review. "Fine," I lied, "just working through some concept refinements." He moved behind my chair, looking over my shoulder at the blank artboard that betrayed my complete creative paralysis. The silence stretched between us like a held breath. "Thea," he said, finally, his voice carrying a weight that made my stomach drop. "We need to talk." Those 4 words. In 4 years of marriage, I'd learned that when Ian needed to talk, it meant I was about to receive feedback I wasn't ready to hear. But something in his tone felt different this morning. Final. He sat down across from me at our granite island, the expensive surface reflecting the morning light streaming through windows that had been professionally cleaned just days before. Everything in our kitchen gleamed with the kind of perfection that required constant maintenance, the kind of beauty that was exhausting to sustain. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, folding his hands in front of him with the same composed posture he used in business meetings. "About us, about where we're heading, about whether this is sustainable." Sustainable. The word hit like a physical blow because I knew exactly what he meant. I wasn't sustainable. My anxiety, my creative blocks, my inability to meet the standards he'd helped me establish, I'd become a liability rather than an asset. "I've tried to help you," he continued, his voice carrying the patient disappointment of someone who'd given their best effort to a hopeless cause. "God knows I've tried. The therapy recommendations, the business coaching, all those conversations about positioning yourself professionally. But you're not improving, Thea. If anything, you're getting worse." Getting worse. The phrase settled into my chest like ice. Was I getting worse? Or was I finally cracking under the pressure of trying to become someone I'd never been meant to be? "Look at this," he gestured toward my laptop screen, still displaying the empty design document. 3 months ago, you would have finished this project in a week. Now you can't even start it. When was the last time you landed a significant client? When was the last time you created something you were genuinely proud of?" I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain about the creative paralysis, the anxiety that seized me every time I tried to make design decisions. But what defense could I offer? He was right about the facts, even if he was wrong about their meaning. "I watch Emily work," he said, and there it was, the comparison that had become the soundtrack to my professional inadequacy. She approaches every project with confidence, with clarity of vision. She doesn't second-guess every decision or need constant reassurance. She trusts her instincts. Emily. Of course this conversation would center on Emily, the woman who represented everything I'd failed to become despite years of Ian's patient guidance. "Emily knows who she is professionally," he continued. "She knows her value, her capabilities, her place in the industry. She doesn't need anyone to manage her insecurities or validate her choices." Each word felt like a scalpel, precisely cutting away the last remnants of my professional confidence. Emily didn't need management. Emily didn't require constant support. Emily was self-sufficient in all the ways I've proven myself dependent and needy. "I've been thinking about what's fair," Ian said,
his tone shifting into the clinical detachment that had become his default mode when discussing my shortcomings. Fair to you, fair to me, fair to both of our futures. Our futures. The phrase carried an ominous finality that made my hands start shaking. You deserve someone who can appreciate who you are without trying to change you, he said. And for a moment, his words sounded almost kind. Someone who doesn't see your challenges as problems that need solving. Challenges. Such a diplomatic way to describe the systematic dismantling of everything I'd once been confident about. And I deserve a partner who can match my energy, my ambitions, my vision for what our life could be. His voice gained strength as he moved toward the conclusion he'd obviously rehearsed. Someone who enhances my life instead of requiring constant accommodation.
Constant accommodation. 4 years of marriage reduced to a burden he'd been carrying, a series of inconvenient adjustments he'd made to his perfect life to account for my inadequacies. You're too broken to fix, Thea. The words landed with brutal clarity, each syllable precisely delivered. Not spoken in anger, not thrown as weapons in the heat of argument, just stated as fact, like a medical diagnosis or a performance evaluation. Too broken to fix. Emily understands what it means to be a real partner, he continued, and now the truth was finally completely exposed. She knows how to support someone's success instead of requiring constant emotional management. She brings value to the relationship instead of just need. Need. My need for reassurance when creative projects felt overwhelming. My need for emotional support when his criticism cut too deep. My need for someone to see me as more than a collection of problems requiring solutions. All of it reframed as selfishness, as taking without giving, as evidence of my fundamental insufficiency. I'm leaving, he said simply. Emily and I have found a place in the Pearl District, something more suited to where we are in our careers, our lives. Our careers, not my career, which had withered under his care like a plant kept in the wrong kind of soil. I'll have the divorce papers drawn up. Curtis recommended someone who can handle this efficiently, without unnecessary drama. Unnecessary drama. My potential emotional response to the end of our marriage was already being dismissed as an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a natural reaction to betrayal. The house is paid off, he added, as if this generosity would somehow soften the brutality of what he'd just delivered. Consider it compensation for the time we spent trying to make this work. Compensation. 4 years of marriage, 4 years of trying to become worthy of his love, reduced to a real estate transaction. I sat there in our perfect kitchen, surrounded by the gleaming surfaces and carefully curated aesthetic that had never felt like home, and realized that this moment had been inevitable from the day I'd first changed clothes to better fit into his world. Ian wasn't leaving because I'd become broken. He was leaving because I'd never successfully transformed into the woman he'd tried to create. Despite all his patient guidance, all his helpful suggestions, all his attempts to improve me, I'd remained fundamentally myself, messy, emotional, creative, in ways that didn't translate to corporate success. This isn't cruel, he said, perhaps reading something in my expression that suggested I might see it that way. This is honest. We both deserve to be with people who don't require us to be anything other than who we naturally are. But I hadn't been naturally anything for so long that I no longer remembered who that person was supposed to be. As Ian stood up from the table, straightening his perfect tie and checking his watch with the same mechanical precision he applied to everything in his life, I realized that he was right about one thing. We both deserve to be with people who don't require us to be anything other than who we naturally are. The tragedy was that I'd forgotten who I naturally was so completely that I'd have to learn how to be myself all over again. And I'd have to do it alone, in this empty house that had never been mine, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd never actually wanted. But for the first time in years, Alone sounded like freedom. The sound of Ian's car pulling out of our driveway felt like the final punctuation mark on 4 years of marriage. I sat at the kitchen island for another 20 minutes, staring at the wedding ring he'd left behind on the granite countertop, trying to process that my life had just fundamentally shifted while the coffee maker still gurgled and the neighbor's dog still barked at passing joggers. Everything looked exactly the same. The stainless steel appliances gleamed with their usual sterile perfection, the carefully selected artwork hung at precisely measured intervals along the walls, the fresh flowers Ian had insisted on purchasing weekly, for the photos, he'd always said, still brightened the dining room table with their orchestrated beauty. But something essential had been extracted from the space, leaving it feeling like a museum exhibit, rather than a home where two people had shared meals, conversations, and the mundane intimacy of married life. My phone buzzed against the counter. A text from Connor, one of Ian's colleagues. "Heard about you and Ian. So sorry. He mentioned you were going through some personal struggles. Hope you get the help you need." Personal struggles. Even in his exit, Ian had managed to control the narrative. I wasn't a wife whose husband had left her for another woman. I was someone with personal struggles who had required more help than could reasonably be provided. 3 more texts arrived in rapid succession. Curtis from the law firm. "Sorry to hear about the separation. Ian mentioned you might need some time to get back on your feet financially. Happy to recommend some resources." Tanner from Ian's softball league. "Tough break, Thea. Ian said you'd been having a hard time with work stuff. Maybe this is a chance for a fresh start?" Even Matt, our next-door neighbor. "Saw Ian moving out this morning. He mentioned you've been dealing with some health issues. Let me know if you need anything." Health issues, work problems, personal struggles, financial instability. Within hours of leaving, Ian had already rewritten our entire marriage as a tragic tale of his noble attempts to support a fundamentally unstable person through various crises. He'd positioned himself as the patient, long-suffering husband who'd finally reached the reasonable conclusion that some people simply couldn't be helped. I scrolled through my contacts, looking for someone to call who might offer a different perspective, but the list felt like inventory of a life that no longer belonged to me. Most of the numbers were Ian's friends who'd become our friends, his colleagues who'd tolerated me at work events, his family members who'd always seemed slightly puzzled by his choice in wives. Leah's name appeared halfway down the list, and I stared at it for a long time before realizing I wasn't sure she'd even answer. When was the last time we'd spoken? Really spoken, not just exchanged brief pleasantries in grocery store checkout lines or liked each other's social media posts. I tried to remember when I'd stopped calling Leah, stopped making plans with the woman who'd once been my closest friend. The distance had happened gradually, each declined invitation or canceled coffee date explained by legitimate conflicts with Ian's schedule, work events I needed to attend, couples dinners that couldn't accommodate additional guests, weekend trips that were more romantic with just the two of us. Now, sitting alone in my perfect kitchen, I realized that Ian had never actually forbidden me from maintaining my friendships. He'd simply made it increasingly difficult and socially awkward to prioritize them over his needs. "You're always so tired after spending time with Leah," he'd observe, after I'd returned from our occasional coffee dates. "She's very intense. All that drama about her dating life and her work complaints. Maybe you need friends who are more positive influences." Positive influences, people who didn't encourage me to question his gentle guidance or remind me of who I'd been before I'd begun the project of becoming worthy of his love. The house felt impossibly large around me. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a formal dining room we'd used exactly twice in 4 years. Ian had insisted we needed space to grow into, space for the entertaining we'd do once I became the kind of wife who could handle sophisticated dinner parties. But I'd never become that wife. Instead, I'd become smaller and smaller until I'd practically disappeared into the oversized rooms, a tiny figure rattling around in a showcase home that demanded a more impressive occupant. My laptop still sat open on the counter, the blank design document mocking me with its emptiness.
The nonprofit project deadline was in 2 weeks, and I still hadn't created anything beyond the most generic, uninspired concepts, the kind of work that would earn polite acceptance rather than genuine enthusiasm. The phone rang, making me jump. Morrison residence? I answered automatically, then realized with a shock that it might not be the Morrison residence much longer. Would I keep Ian's name after the divorce, or reclaim my maiden name along with whatever else remained of who I used to be? Mrs. Morrison, this is Rebecca from Dr. Patterson's office. We have your test results from last week's blood work. Dr. Patterson, the physician Ian had found for me when he'd decided my anxiety and creative blocks might be medical issues requiring professional intervention. Another expert brought in to help solve the problem of my inadequacy. Everything looks normal, Rebecca continued cheerfully. Your thyroid levels are fine, no signs of depression markers, iron levels are good. Dr. Patterson said to tell you that sometimes creative blocks are just part of the process, not symptoms of underlying health problems. Not symptoms of underlying health problems. For months, Ian had been suggesting that my creative struggles might be physiological, encouraging me to seek medical explanations for what he'd termed my cognitive decline. He'd made appointments, researched supplements, even suggested I might have developed some kind of attention disorder that was interfering with my ability to focus.
But apparently, there was nothing wrong with my body or brain that could account for my professional paralysis. The problem wasn't medical. It was that I'd been systematically trained to doubt every creative instinct I possessed. After hanging up, I walked through our house as if seeing it for the first time. The living room with furniture that looked like it belonged in a high-end hotel lobby rather than a space where people actually relaxed. The master bedroom with its carefully coordinated colors and complete absence of personality. The guest rooms that had never hosted guests because Ian preferred to maintain them as pristine displays rather than functional spaces. Every room told the same story. This was a house designed to impress rather than to live in. Curated to reflect success rather than comfort, optimized for the photographs Ian posted on social media rather than for the daily experience of the people who supposedly called it home. In the hallway, I stopped in front of a small framed photo from our honeymoon in Napa Valley. Ian and I stood in front of a vineyard, both smiling at the camera. But looking at it now, I could see the strain in my expression, the way my smile seemed forced and uncertain. Even then, just days after our wedding, I'd been trying too hard to be the wife he'd wanted rather than the woman I was. When had photographs of us become performances rather than memories? My phone buzzed again. This time it was Irene, my sister, calling from Denver. I just saw Ian's Facebook post, she said without preamble. Are you okay? What happened? Facebook post. Of course Ian had already made our separation public, probably with carefully chosen words about growing apart and wishing each other well. Clean, mature, designed to generate sympathy for his difficult position rather than questions about his character. I started, then stopped. Was I okay? The honest answer was that I didn't know what okay looked like anymore. I'm figuring it out. Do you want me to come visit? I can take a few days off work. The offer made me realize how long it had been since anyone had offered to drop everything to support me through a crisis. Ian had trained me to be so self-sufficient, so careful not to burden others with my problems, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone willing to show up without conditions or expectations. Maybe, I said, surprised by how much I wanted to say yes. Let me think about it. After we hung up, I sat in the living room that had never felt comfortable and tried to imagine what came next. The divorce proceedings Ian had mentioned, the financial arrangements, the question of whether to keep this house that felt more like a monument to his ambitions than a home where I could rebuild my life. For the first time in years, the future felt completely unscripted, terrifying, but also oddly liberating. I no longer had to worry about disappointing Ian, about failing to meet his standards, about becoming the wife he'd deserved. I no longer had to apologize for taking up space or requiring emotional support or wanting things he didn't value.
I could fail spectacularly at becoming anyone other than who I actually was, and the only person who would be disappointed was me. Somehow, that felt like the beginning of possibility rather than the end of everything I'd worked for. The house was still too big, too cold, too perfectly curated for someone else's life. But for the first time in 4 years, it was also completely mine to figure out. Curtis arrived at my door exactly 3 days after Ian left, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of smile that was meant to be reassuring, but felt more like preparation for surgery without anesthesia. "Thea, I'm so sorry about all this," he said, stepping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "Ian asked me to handle the paperwork personally. He wants this to be as smooth as possible for both of you." Smooth for both of us. I led Curtis into the living room, watching him appraise the expensive furniture and carefully curated artwork with the calculating gaze of someone mentally tallying assets. "Ian's being very generous," Curtis continued, settling into the designer armchair that had cost more than my old car. "Leaving you the house, covering all the legal fees, even maintaining your health insurance through the end of the year. Most men wouldn't be so considerate during a separation." Considerate? The word sat strangely against the memory of Ian's clinical delivery of my fundamental inadequacy just days before. But apparently, generosity in divorce proceedings could retroactively transform cruelty into kindness. "He mentioned you've been struggling professionally," Curtis added, pulling documents from his briefcase. "The agreement reflects that reality. No alimony expectations, given your limited earning potential in the current market."
Limited earning potential. My freelance design business, which had once supported me comfortably, reframed as evidence of professional failure rather than the systematic undermining of my creative confidence. Of course, if your circumstances improve significantly, Ian's open to renegotiating the terms, Curtis said, spreading papers across the coffee table like he was dealing cards. But given your recent performance issues, he thinks it's more realistic to assume you'll need time to get back on your feet. Performance issues. I stared at the divorce documents, each page dense with legal language that reduced 4 years of marriage to financial calculations and asset distribution. No mention of emotional manipulation, no accounting for the systematic erosion of self-worth. Just cold numbers that told the story of a failed wife who'd been fortunate to receive such generous treatment from her patient, successful husband. "This section covers the house transfer," Curtis explained, pointing to a paragraph filled with property law terminology. "Ian's removing his name from the deed entirely. Very unusual, honestly. Most people would want to maintain some equity in a property this valuable." I looked around the living room with its neutral palette and hotel lobby aesthetic. Valuable, certainly, but valuable to whom? I'd never chosen any of this furniture, never had input on the color scheme, never felt comfortable in these rooms that were designed to impress rather than welcome. "There is one small complication," Curtis said, his tone shifting slightly. "The mortgage company requires updated income verification for the transfer. They'll need tax returns, bank statements, proof of ongoing earning capacity." Ongoing earning capacity? The non-profit project still sat unfinished on my laptop, a daily reminder that I could no longer access the creative abilities that had once defined my professional identity. "How recent do the income statements need to be?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be problematic. "Last 6 months, preferably. They want to ensure you can maintain the property taxes, insurance, utilities. It's a significant monthly obligation, Thea. Are you confident you can handle it long-term?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Could I handle it? I'd been barely handling anything lately, creatively or financially. The house that Ian presented as generous compensation might actually be an elegant trap, too expensive for me to maintain, but too valuable to sell without significant capital gains taxes. "I'll need to review my accounts," I said, though we both knew what that reveal would reveal. Curtis nodded sympathetically. "Ian mentioned you might want to consider downsizing, something more manageable. He'd be happy to help you find a realtor when you're ready." When you're ready. The phrasing suggested inevitability rather than choice.
Of course I'd need to downsize. Of course this house was beyond my limited capabilities. Of course Ian's generous gift would ultimately prove too much for me to handle, reinforcing his narrative about my fundamental inadequacy. The other consideration, Curtis continued, is your business situation. The IRS classification for your freelance work affects the property transfer. Right now, you're classified as a sole proprietor, which provides certain tax advantages. But if your income drops below viability thresholds, he trailed off, letting me fill in the implications. If I couldn't resurrect my design business, if I couldn't land clients willing to pay professional rates, if I couldn't overcome the creative paralysis that had been building for months, then even the tax structure of my work would become another liability. Ian suggested you might want to consider transitioning to traditional employment, Curtis said. More stable income, benefits, regular schedule might be better suited to your current situation. Traditional employment. A regular job with a boss, set hours, creative decisions made by committee. Everything I'd left behind when I'd started my freelance business, back when I'd believed in my ability to build something meaningful and independent. What kind of timeline are we looking at? I asked. Ian's eager to finalize everything quickly. Clean break, fresh starts for everyone involved. Emily's been very understanding, but they're ready to move forward with their plans. Emily's been understanding. Of course, their new life together was being delayed by the inconvenient logistics of Ian's previous marriage. My inability to process paperwork efficiently was now affecting not just Ian, but his patient, long-suffering new partner. Curtis spent another hour walking me through financial disclosures, asset valuations, and timeline expectations. Each document painted the same picture: a generous husband providing for an incapable wife who'd been fortunate to receive such consideration despite her obvious limitations.
One last thing, Curtis said as he prepared to leave. Ian wanted me to give you this. He handed me an envelope with my name written in Ian's precise handwriting. He thought it might help with closure. After Curtis left, I sat alone with the envelope for over an hour before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of Ian's personal stationery, expensive paper with his initials embossed at the top. "Thea," it began, "I hope you understand that this decision comes from a place of caring rather than cruelty. You deserve someone who can appreciate your unique qualities without trying to change them. I've realized that my attempts to help you reach your potential may have been misguided. Perhaps you're simply meant for a different kind of life than the one we tried to build together. I wish you peace and the kind of happiness that fits who you really are. Ian." Who you really are. After 4 years of systematic modification, the phrase felt like a foreign concept. But embedded in Ian's final message was something I hadn't expected, the first suggestion that maybe the problem hadn't been my resistance to improvement, but his definition of what improvement looked like. Maybe you're meant for a different kind of life. The words were intended as gentle dismissal, a kind way of saying I wasn't capable of the sophisticated existence he'd envisioned. But sitting alone in our sterile living room, surrounded by divorce papers that reduced my worth to financial calculations, I began to wonder if he was accidentally right. Maybe I was meant for a different kind of life. Not a lesser life, not a consolation prize for failing to meet his standards, but a life that honored the person I'd been before I'd started apologizing for taking up space in the world. The question was whether I could remember who that person was well enough to build a life she might actually want to live. The legal paperwork made it clear that Ian's version of our story was already set in stone. Generous husband, grateful recipient, clean break, fresh starts. But stories, I was beginning to remember, could be rewritten by whoever held the pen. And for the first time in years, I was the only one holding mine. The first thing I did after Curtis left was order Thai food so spicy it made my eyes water. Not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I suddenly remembered loving the burn of chilies on my tongue, the way heat could wake up taste buds that had been dulled by years of sophisticated cuisine. I ate it sitting on the floor of my living room instead of at the formal dining table, using chopsticks I found buried in a kitchen drawer behind the specialized serving utensils Ian had insisted we needed for entertaining.
The takeout container looked beautifully out of place against the neutral carpet, a splash of real color in a room designed to photograph well rather than to live in. Small rebellions, but they felt like reclamations. The next morning, I called the nonprofit director about the logo project I'd been paralyzed over for weeks. "I know this is unprofessional," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "but I need to start over completely. The concepts I've been developing don't capture what you're actually looking for. They're technically competent, but emotionally empty." I braced myself for disappointment, for the polite dismissal that would confirm Ian's assessment of my professional inadequacy. Instead, she laughed. "Thank God, I was trying to tell you the same thing. Those designs felt like they could belong to any organization. Where's the joy you talked about in our initial meeting?" Joy. When had I stopped designing with joy? "Give me 2 weeks," I said. "Let me try something completely different." That afternoon, I drove to Powell's Books for the first time in over a year. Ian had discouraged my browsing habits there, claiming that independent bookstores were financially irresponsible when everything was available online for less money. But I'd missed the smell of old paper and new possibilities, the way random book discoveries could spark unexpected creative connections. I spent 3 hours wandering the stacks, pulling books that caught my interest rather than ones that would look impressive on coffee tables. Poetry collections I'd never heard of, biographies of artists who'd lived messy, authentic lives, design books from small publishers that celebrated risk-taking over commercial success. In the graphic design section, I found a book about community-based art projects and felt something stir that I'd almost forgotten: the excitement of creative problem-solving, the satisfaction of visual solutions that served real people rather than abstract business objectives. I bought 7 books and carried them home like treasures.
That evening, instead of forcing myself to work on the nonprofit project, I did something I hadn't done in years. I sketched for pleasure. No client brief, no strategic objectives, no concern for professional standards. Just pen on paper, letting my hand follow impulses I'd trained myself to suppress. The drawings were rough, unpolished, exactly the kind of work Ian would have dismissed as self-indulgent, but they were mine in a way I'd forgotten work could be. Over the following days, I established new routines that had nothing to do with professional productivity or self-improvement. I woke up when my body felt ready rather than at the optimized time Ian had calculated for maximum efficiency. I made coffee in my old French press instead of the expensive espresso machine that required precise measurements and timing. I played music while I worked, not the ambient electronica Ian preferred for its non-distracting qualities, but the folk and indie rock that had once soundtracked my most creative periods. Songs with actual lyrics, actual emotion, the kind of music that could inspire rather than simply provide background. The house began to feel different around me. Still too large, still decorated in colors that reflected Ian's taste rather than mine, but somehow more breathable. I opened windows that had been kept closed to maintain climate control for the artwork. I moved furniture slightly, creating conversation areas instead of showroom displays. Small changes, but they made the space feel less like a museum and more like a place where someone actually lived. I started calling people. Not Ian's colleagues or the professional contacts he'd encouraged me to cultivate, but friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage. Conversations that began with awkward explanations, "I know it's been forever, but," and evolved into reminders of who I'd been before I'd started apologizing for existing. Tiffany, Leah's former roommate, now working as a social worker in Eugene. She'd always been the practical one in our college group, but her voice carried the same warmth I remembered. "I wondered what happened to you," she said. "Leah mentioned you'd gotten married to some corporate guy, but then you just kind of disappeared." Disappeared. That was exactly what had happened, though I'd been too deep in the process to recognize it at the time. "I'm trying to undisappear," I told her. "Good," she said simply. "The world needs more Thea Morrison, not less." The words hit harder than they should have. When was the last time someone had suggested the world needed more of me rather than a better version of me? I started taking walks in the neighborhood, really seeing it for the first time instead of just driving through it on the way to somewhere else.
Our street was lined with craftsman houses built in the 1920s, each one slightly different, each one reflecting the personality of its inhabitants in ways our modern box never had. Gardens spilled over fences with cheerful disregard for property lines, children's toys scattered across lawns suggested families who prioritized play over presentation. Front porches held mismatched furniture that looked comfortable rather than coordinated. Normal life. Messy, authentic, unapologetic normal life. The nonprofit logo started coming together organically, born from walks and sketches and the memory of what community actually looked like. Not the sanitized version Ian had preferred, but the real thing. Imperfect, diverse, beautiful in its refusal to conform to anyone's standards except its own. For the first time in months, I was creating something I actually wanted to see in the world. The nonprofit director cried when I presented the final logo design. Not polite tears of professional satisfaction, but the kind of emotional response that happens when someone sees their vision translated into something they didn't know they were hoping for. The design was everything the conservative concepts hadn't been. 3 interconnected circles in warm, organic colors: deep forest green, sunset orange, ocean blue, with hand-lettered text that felt approachable rather than corporate. Inside each circle, simple line drawings showed different people engaged in creative activities. An elderly woman painting, a child sculpting with clay, teenagers collaborating on a mural. "This is exactly what we are," she said, holding the presentation board like it was precious. "It shows that art isn't about being perfect or trained or talented enough, it's about being human and wanting to create something together." The logo won a local design award 3 weeks later. Not the kind of prestigious national recognition that Ian would have considered career-changing, but acknowledgement from my own creative community that my work had value beyond commercial metrics.
More importantly, it led to other projects with organizations that valued authentic connection over polished presentation. A local food bank that needed materials reflecting the dignity of their clients rather than stereotypical charity imagery. A community theater producing works by emerging playwrights, looking for visual identity that captured their commitment to artistic risk-taking. Each project felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd thought was lost forever. The financial reality was messier than the creative satisfaction. These clients had smaller budgets than the corporate accounts Ian had encouraged me to pursue. Payment schedules were irregular. Project scopes sometimes expanded beyond original agreements because the work felt meaningful rather than transactional. But my bank account, while modest, was growing steadily. More importantly, I was building a portfolio that reflected my actual values rather than my attempts to impress people whose approval I didn't really want. I started a blog documenting the projects, not as marketing strategy, but as a way to process what I was learning about design that served communities rather than corporations. The writing came easier than it had in years, probably because I was finally describing work I genuinely cared about. Finding your visual voice after losing it became the most read post, shared across design forums and social media by people who recognized their own struggles in my description of creative paralysis and recovery. Comments poured in from other freelancers who'd experienced similar professional crises, designers who'd become so focused on client satisfaction that they'd forgotten their own aesthetic instincts. Artists who'd spent years creating work that paid well but left them feeling empty. "Your story made me realize I haven't loved a single project in 2 years," one commenter wrote. "I thought that was just professionalism, but maybe it's professional suicide." The blog led to speaking opportunities at design conferences, small venues where I could share what I'd learned about maintaining creative authenticity while building sustainable business practices. Not the kind of high-profile keynotes Ian would have considered impressive, but audiences who genuinely wanted to hear about creative recovery rather than just commercial success. My income reached levels I hadn't seen since the early days of my marriage, when I'd been confident enough to charge appropriately for work I believed in. But more significant than the financial stability was the return of creative energy that had been dormant for so long I'd forgotten it existed. I started taking on passion projects again, pro bono work for causes that mattered to me, experimental designs that pushed my skills in directions that felt personally meaningful rather than professionally strategic. The community garden logo I'd created years before Ian became the inspiration for a series exploring how visual identity could celebrate local food systems and environmental sustainability. The work was getting noticed not just locally, but by organizations across the Pacific Northwest looking for designers who understood community engagement rather than corporate positioning. My calendar filled with projects that felt more like collaborative art than traditional client services. 6 months after Ian left, I was earning more money, working with more interesting clients, and creating more meaningful work than I had during the final 2 years of our marriage. The creative drought that had convinced both of us I was professionally failing turned out to be the result of trying to force my work into shapes that had never fit my actual abilities. When I finally allowed myself to create from authentic motivation rather than external expectations, the creative well that had seemed permanently dry began flowing again with surprising abundance. The house that had felt too expensive to maintain was now comfortably affordable. The mortgage that Curtis had worried I couldn't handle was being paid ahead of schedule. The financial instability Ian had predicted turned out to be another way he'd underestimated my capabilities when I was allowed to operate from my actual strengths rather than trying to compensate for manufactured weaknesses. But the most unexpected success wasn't professional or financial. It was the return of something I'd almost forgotten: the simple pleasure of waking up excited about the work I was going to do that day. For the first time in years, I was building something that felt like it belonged to me, rather than trying to inhabit someone else's definition of what my life should look like. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ian had left because I was too broken to fix, too professionally inadequate to be worth the continued investment of his patience and guidance. But apparently, I'd never been broken. I'd just been trying to bloom in the wrong kind of soil. Given the right conditions, authentic, creative challenges, clients who valued collaboration over compliance, work that served real human needs rather than abstract business objectives, I was flourishing in ways that surprised even me. The woman Ian had tried so hard to improve had been perfectly capable of success all along. She just needed to be allowed to define success for herself. I learned about Ian's new life the way most people learn about their exes these days, through carefully curated social media posts that told a story almost too perfect to be believable. The Pearl District apartment he shared with Emily was a masterpiece of modern minimalism, all clean lines and expensive fixtures photographed with professional lighting. Ian stood in the center of these pristine spaces with the same confident smile I'd once found so attractive, now holding Emily's hand as she gazed up at him with the kind of adoration I recognized from my own early photographs. "New beginnings with this amazing woman," read the caption under a photo of them at some charity gala, Emily wearing a black dress that could have come from the same boutique where Ian had once steered me toward appropriate choices. She looked elegant, sophisticated, everything Ian had spent years trying to help me become. But I'd learned to read the language of Ian's social media presentations. The apartment, while beautiful, was staged with the same sterile perfection that had characterized our house, more concerned with impression management than actual comfort. Emily's smile, while bright, held the same tension around the edges that I'd developed during our marriage, the look of someone working very hard to be worthy of the life she was being offered. The details that others might miss jumped out at me with uncomfortable familiarity. Emily's clothes in every photo were clearly selected by Ian, the same color palette he'd preferred on me, the same conservative styling that prioritized elegance over personal expression. Her hairstyle had evolved over the months from something casual and individual to the kind of polished look that photographed well but required daily maintenance. In earlier posts, Emily had appeared in what were obviously her own clothes: a vintage band t-shirt here, a brightly colored scarf there, small signs of personality that had made her look approachable and genuine. But as their relationship progressed through the timeline of Ian's Instagram account, those personal touches disappeared, replaced by the uniform sophistication that I recognized as Ian's aesthetic preferences. The most telling detail was in a post from their 3-month anniversary dinner. Emily sat across from Ian at an expensive restaurant, smiling dutifully while he held up a wine glass and a toast. But her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white with tension that contradicted her serene expression. I recognized that grip, the physical manifestation of trying very hard to be the right kind of grateful for experiences that felt more like performances than pleasures. Ian's captions had shifted too, in ways that would be invisible to casual observers, but felt painfully familiar to me. Where he'd once posted about Emily's professional accomplishments and independent achievements, his recent updates focused more on their relationship dynamic and her role in supporting his success. So grateful for a partner who understands the demands of building something meaningful, read one post, accompanying a photo of Emily bringing him coffee while he worked on his laptop. The image was meant to convey domestic bliss, but I could see the careful staging. Emily's outfit coordinated with the apartment's color scheme, her posture positioned to show appreciation rather than equality. Another post showed them at Ian's company retreat, Emily smiling beside a group of wives and girlfriends I recognized from my own reluctant attendance at similar events. Ian had written, "Emily fits right in with the team. It's amazing how some people just naturally understand professional environments." Naturally understand. The phrase made my stomach clench with recognition. I'd heard similar praise during my own early integration into Ian's professional world, before I'd started disappointing him with my inability to maintain that natural understanding consistently. The most revealing post was one Ian had clearly meant as a compliment, but read like a warning to anyone who knew how to decode his language. Emily stood in their kitchen, wearing an apron that matched the apartment's minimalist aesthetic, presenting a meal she'd clearly spent hours preparing. The caption read, "Coming home to this every night. Emily never complains about the long hours. She just makes everything better." Never complains. I'd heard that phrase applied to me too, in the early days when my accommodating nature had seemed like a positive quality rather than a warning sign of systematic self-erasure.
But the most unsettling detail was in the background of these domestic scenes. Emily's laptop sat closed on the counter, pushed aside to make room for the elaborate cooking project. Her work materials, the creative briefs and client folders that had once figured prominently in Ian's posts about her professional success, were nowhere to be seen. I'd checked Emily's own social media accounts, finding them increasingly sparse and generic. Where she'd once posted about client wins and creative challenges, her recent updates were almost exclusively photos of the meals she'd cooked, the apartment she'd helped organize, the events she'd attended as Ian's supportive partner. Her bio still listed her as a marketing strategist, but her last post about an actual work project was from 2 months ago. Everything since then had been relationship-focused, as if her professional identity was gradually being absorbed into her role as Ian's girlfriend. The transformation was happening faster than it had with me, probably because Ian had learned from our relationship what worked and what didn't. Why spend years gradually reshaping someone when you could accelerate the process with the lessons learned from your previous attempts at improvement? Emily was being systematically edited with the efficiency of someone who'd perfected the technique through practice. The saddest part was how proud Ian seemed of the results. His posts radiated the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found a partner willing to be molded into his ideal companion. Emily appeared to be succeeding where I had failed, gracefully accepting his guidance, effortlessly meeting his standards, naturally understanding what he needed from a relationship. But I'd succeeded too, at first. The early months of our relationship had been filled with Ian's similar pride in how well I was adapting to his world, how naturally I seemed to understand what he needed from a partner. The failure had come later, when the performance became too exhausting to maintain, and my authentic self had started pushing back against the careful construction he'd helped me build. Emily's failure would come too, because it always did. You can only edit yourself for so long before the authentic person underneath starts fighting for air. The only question was how much of herself she'd lose in the process, and whether she'd have enough left to rebuild when the inevitable collapse came. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 8 months after Ian had walked out of our kitchen with his expensive luggage and his clinical assessment of my fundamental inadequacy.
I was at my drafting table, working on a series of illustrations for a children's literacy nonprofit, when an unknown number flashed across my screen. "Hello?" I answered, expecting a robocall or wrong number. "Thea?" The voice was barely above a whisper, shaky and unfamiliar. "This is Emily Chen. I got your number from the office directory. I hope that's okay." Emily. The name hit like ice water, bringing with it a flood of complicated emotions I'd spent months processing through therapy and creative work. The perfect woman Ian had left me for, the standard against which I'd been measured and found wanting for over a year of my marriage. "I know this is strange," she continued, her words coming in rushed, uneven bursts. "I know you probably hate me. I wouldn't blame you if you hung up. But I didn't know who else to call." The desperation in her voice was unmistakable, raw in a way that cut through any animosity I might have expected to feel. This wasn't the confident, sophisticated Emily from Ian's social media posts. This was someone drowning. "What's wrong?" I asked, surprising myself with the genuine concern in my voice. "Everything," she said, and then she was crying. Not the delicate tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the harsh sobs of someone who'd been holding back a breakdown for too long. I can't do this anymore, Thea. I thought I could, but I can't." I waited while she gathered herself, staring out my window at the maple tree that had turned brilliant orange in the fall weather. The same tree Ian had wanted to remove because it blocked his preferred sightlines from the living room. "He talks about you," Emily said finally. "About how you couldn't handle the pressure of being with someone successful, how you were too sensitive, too needy, how you made everything about yourself instead of supporting his career." The familiar accusation stung even secondhand, but I noticed something in Emily's tone that surprised me. Not agreement or understanding, but something that sounded almost like recognition. "But I'm starting to think," she paused, as if afraid to voice whatever realization was forming. "I'm starting to think, maybe it wasn't about you being inadequate. Maybe it was about him needing you to be inadequate." The words hung in the air between us, carrying weight I wasn't sure either of us was prepared to handle. "Tell me what's been happening," I said gently, settling into my chair as if preparing for a long conversation I'd been unconsciously expecting for months. Emily's breath shuddered through the phone. "It started so perfectly. He was everything I thought I wanted. Successful, confident, knew exactly what he wanted from life. When he told me about your marriage, about how you'd struggled with anxiety and professional issues, I felt sorry for you, but also grateful that he'd learned what he needed in a partner." The familiar narrative. I'd heard Ian tell similar stories about his previous relationships. Women who'd been too dramatic, too needy, too unable to handle the demands of being with someone ambitious. "He said you'd never really supported his career goals," Emily continued, "that you resented his success, made him feel guilty for working late or traveling for business. He made it sound like you were holding him back from his potential." I thought about all those late nights I'd spent alone, telling myself that his work was more important than my need for company. All the business trips I'd smiled through while secretly wishing he'd miss me enough to call more than once. I'd supported his career to the point of abandoning my own creative momentum. "What changed?" I asked. "Everything, but so gradually I didn't notice until—" She paused, and I could hear her moving around, probably pacing the way I used to when anxiety made sitting still impossible. 3 months ago, I had to turn down a major client presentation because Ian had planned a surprise weekend away. He said it would be romantic, that I worked too much, and needed to learn better work-life balance. Work-life balance. The phrase Ian had used to justify his systematic interference with anything that took my attention away from his needs. But when I told him I needed to reschedule because this client could launch my career to the next level, he got this look, this disappointment, like I was being selfish and ungrateful. He said successful couples made sacrifices for each other, and wasn't our relationship more important than one business opportunity?
The manipulation was so familiar, it made my teeth ache. Frame the partner's professional needs as selfishness. Position his demands as relationship investment. Make her choose between career advancement and being a good girlfriend, then act wounded when she hesitated. I went on the weekend trip, Emily said quietly, and while we were gone, the client signed with someone else. Ian was so supportive afterward, saying there would be other opportunities, better opportunities for someone with my talent. But there hadn't been other opportunities, had there? I already knew how this story went. That's when he started helping me with my client presentations, she continued. Just small suggestions at first. This color palette might be too bold. This concept might be too creative for a corporate client. Maybe I should consider more traditional approaches that showed I understood business objectives. The same helpful guidance that had systematically drained the creativity from my work until I could no longer access the instincts that had made me successful in the first place. My work started looking like everyone else's, professional, polished, completely forgettable. And when clients stopped responding enthusiastically, Ian was there to explain that the market was changing, that maybe I needed to adjust my expectations, that not everyone was cut out for high-level strategic work. Emily, I said, my voice rougher than I'd intended, how long has it been since you landed a client you were genuinely excited about? The silence stretched so long, I wondered if she'd hung up. 4 months, she whispered finally. And Ian keeps saying it's just a rough patch, that maybe I should consider joining a firm instead of trying to maintain my own practice. More stability, better benefits, less stress about business development. Less independence, less creative control, less of everything that had made her successful before Ian started helping her improve. Emily, I said, leaning forward in my chair as if she could see me through the phone. I need to tell you something that's going to be hard to hear. Ian didn't leave me because I was broken. He left because I was starting to remember who I was before he convinced me I needed fixing. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if I'd lost her. "What do you mean?" she asked finally, her voice small and uncertain. 8 months ago, I was exactly where you are now, creatively paralyzed, financially struggling, convinced that I was the problem in our relationship. But you know what happened after he left? I walked to my drafting table, looking at the children's book illustrations spread across the surface, work that was distinctly mine, full of the personality and warmth that Ian had spent years trying to edit out of my designs. I started creating again, real work, meaningful work. Within 3 months, I was earning more than I had during the last 2 years of our marriage. Not because I suddenly became more talented, but because I stopped trying to create what Ian thought I should create and started trusting my own instincts again. That's impossible, Emily said, but her voice carried hope rather than disbelief. He said you were barely functional after the divorce, that you'd probably have to sell the house, maybe move back with family. Emily, I paid off 6 months of my mortgage early last month. I turned down 3 client projects this week because my calendar is completely booked through February. The nonprofit logo that Ian said was too playful for serious clients won a regional design award and led to more work than I can handle. I could hear her breathing change, becoming deeper, more steady. But how is that possible? He was just trying to help us become more professional, more marketable. No, I said firmly. He was systematically destroying our confidence so we'd become dependent on his approval. Think about it, Emily. Before Ian, were you successful? Were you confident in your abilities? Yes, she whispered. I'd just been promoted to senior strategist. I was building my own client base, thinking about starting my own firm. And now? Now I can barely trust myself to choose colors for a business card. The admission hung between us like a confession. I remembered that feeling so clearly, the paralyzing self-doubt that had made every creative decision feel like a potential catastrophe. Emily, what Ian does isn't love. It's not even improvement. It's systematic demolition disguised as care. He finds successful, confident women and slowly convinces them they're failing at everything they used to excel at. But why? The question came out broken, confused. What does he get from that? Control. A partner who's so grateful for his patience with their inadequacies that they'll never question his needs, his priorities, his version of reality. Someone who believes they're lucky to have him instead of someone who knows their own worth. I thought about Ian's social media posts, the way he positioned himself as the generous partner tolerating Emily's limitations, just as he'd once positioned himself as the patient husband trying to help his struggling wife. Emily, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. When was the last time Ian asked what you wanted? Not what you thought about his plans, not how you felt about his decisions, but what you actually wanted for your own life. The silence stretched so long, I thought she might have put the phone down. I can't remember, she said finally, her voice breaking. I can't remember the last time anyone asked me that question, including myself. That was the moment I knew she was ready to hear what I was about to tell her. Emily, there's something you need to know about the woman Ian told you about. The one who was too sensitive, too needy, too broken to be a good partner? What about her? She never existed. She was a story Ian created to justify his behavior. The same way he'll create a story about you if you don't get out now. The real Thea, the one sitting here talking to you, was never broken. She was just slowly convinced that her strength was weakness, her independence was selfishness, her creative instincts were professional liabilities. I paused, letting that sink in. And neither are you, Emily. You're not failing at being the partner he needs. You're succeeding at being the victim he requires. There's a difference, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Thea, Emily said, her voice stronger now, carrying a clarity that hadn't been there at the beginning of our conversation. I called you because I was going to ask you to take him back. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd suspected something like this was coming. What? I've been planning it for weeks. I couldn't leave him. We've tangled our finances, signed a lease together, and he's made it clear that if I abandon him the way you did, he'll make sure everyone in our industry knows what kind of person I really am. So I thought, maybe if you took him back, I could just disappear. Let you two work things out while I tried to rebuild whatever's left of my career. The desperation in her plan was heartbreaking and familiar. How many times had I fantasized about escape routes that didn't require me to confront Ian directly? How many nights had I lain awake hoping someone else would solve the problem of my marriage so I wouldn't have to face the reality of what it had become?
But listening to you, Emily continued, understanding what really happened to you, what's happening to me, I realize I wasn't calling to ask you to save me. I was calling to ask you to participate in my own destruction. Emily! No, let me finish. For months, I've been telling myself that I'm not strong enough to leave, that I don't have the resources or the courage or the professional stability. But that's not true, is it? Those are his words in my mouth, his assessment of my capabilities. I closed my eyes, remembering my own version of that revelation. The moment when I'd realized that every limitation I'd accepted about myself had been carefully installed by someone who benefited from my diminished expectations. 6 months ago, I was a successful marketing strategist, building my own client base, Emily said. I had savings, professional relationships, creative confidence. I had everything I needed to build an independent life. The only thing that's changed is that Ian convinced me I was losing all of those things. What are you going to do? I'm going to document everything. Every controlling behavior, every financial manipulation, every time he's isolated me from my professional network or undermined my confidence. Then I'm going to contact a lawyer and get out of this before I lose anything else. The strength in her voice reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. What I'd sounded like before Ian had taught me to doubt every word that came out of my mouth. And Thea, I owe you an apology. Not for Ian leaving you. That wasn't my choice and it wasn't my responsibility. But for believing his version of who you were, instead of questioning why a man would speak so dismissively about someone he'd promised to love.
The apology meant more than she probably realized. For months, I'd carried the weight of being the cautionary tale in Ian's new relationship, the failed wife whose inadequacies justified whatever treatment Emily received. "You don't need to apologize for believing someone you trusted," I said. "But thank you." "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you take your life back. It won't be easy and it won't be quick, but it's possible. I'm living proof that you can recover from this kind of systematic undermining. You can remember who you were before someone convinced you that you needed improvement." We talked for another hour, sharing practical strategies for documenting financial abuse, rebuilding professional confidence, reconnecting with support systems that had been gradually eroded. By the end of the conversation, Emily sounded like a different person, not the broken woman who'd called begging me to rescue her, but someone who was ready to rescue herself. 3 months later, Emily sent me a photo of her new apartment, small but hers, decorated with the bright colors and eclectic artwork that had been slowly edited out of her life during her relationship with Ian. She'd started her own consulting firm, focusing on helping small businesses develop authentic marketing strategies rather than chasing the corporate clients Ian had convinced her to pursue. "Thank you for not taking him back," her text message read. "Thank you for showing me that broken women don't exist, only women who's been convinced they're broken by people who need them to believe it." Ian, predictably, had moved on quickly. His social media now featured a 24-year-old from his gym, someone young enough to be impressed by his success and inexperienced enough to mistake his control for care. The cycle was beginning again, but this time both Emily and I were outside it, watching from the safety of lives we'd rebuilt without his input or approval. I never did take him back, obviously, not because I was angry, though I had been, but because I finally understood what he'd tried so hard to make me forget. I wasn't broken. I was human, and humans aren't meant to be edited, improved, or optimized by people who can only love conditional versions of who we might become. My house, which Ian had left me as compensation for my inadequacy, became the foundation for a life that was messier, more authentic, and infinitely more satisfying than the carefully curated existence we'd built together. I painted the walls colors that made me happy, rather than colors that photographed well. I filled the rooms with plants and books and artwork from local artists whose work spoke to something in my soul. I built a business around work that mattered to me, rather than work that impressed people whose approval I didn't actually want. I reconnected with friends who valued my authentic self, rather than my ability to enhance their social media presence. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own instincts again, to see my sensitivity as strength rather than weakness, my creative risks as professional assets rather than liabilities.
The woman Ian had called too broken to fix had never been broken at all. She'd just been slowly convinced to doubt everything that made her strong, independent, and whole. And once she remembered who she was underneath all that doubt, she turned out to be perfectly capable of building a life worth living. Emily learned the same lesson, and somewhere in the world, other women are learning it too. Because the most powerful thing about surviving someone's attempt to diminish you isn't just the personal recovery, it's the ability to help others recognize that they were never as small as someone needed them to believe. Recovery isn't just personal, it's revolutionary. And sometimes revolution starts with a simple phone call between two women who refuse to believe they were ever broken in the first place.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.